The stories you've heard, the bold cowboys, the golden plains, the sunsets kissed by freedom, were lies told to soften the truth. The American frontier wasn't a place of glory. It was a place of suffering, silence, and survival. Every breath was borrowed. Every step was a gamble. It was a world where mothers screamed into the void during childbirth, where fathers bled in the snow for a loaf of bread, and where children grew up without ever knowing what it meant to feel safe. There were no second chances, no rescue plans, no soft landings, only grit, grief, and the haunting sound of wind whispering through broken walls. The frontier didn't care about dreams. It demanded blood for every mile you claimed. This is not a tale of romance. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of what life was really like on the edge of civilization. 1. No safety net. No second chances. The American frontier wasn't a painting of sunsets and brave cowboys riding into glory. It was a living hell dressed up in dust and silence. Out there, the only law was survival, and survival didn't make promises. There were no ambulances if you broke a bone, no clean clinics if you got infected. Step on a rusted nail, get bitten by a snake, or fall off your horse, and that might be your last moment on Earth. No one came running with a first aid kit. If your wagon snapped an axle 50 miles from the nearest town, you prayed your hands knew how to fix it. If a prairie fire caught your crops or your cabin, you didn't dial help. You ran barefoot into the flames to save what you could. And when illness hit, typhoid, cholera, pneumonia, it wasn't a matter of finding treatment. It was a countdown. Mothers gave birth with no one but God and the wind in the room, kneeling in straw, biting leather straps to bear the pain, bleeding out into the floorboards with their newborns still crying beside them. Children were born into a world where death came quietly, often, and without reason. Every sunrise was earned, not given. You didn't wake up planning your future. You woke up hoping to see the stars one more time before the night froze you or took someone you loved. Chapter: Hunger lived next door. On the frontier, hunger wasn't an occasional inconvenience. It was a neighbor that knocked every night. Food didn't arrive in baskets. It wasn't stored in fridges or stacked in cupboards. One dry season, one lightning strike to your cornfield, one sick cow, and suddenly you were measuring meals in mouthfuls. Children gnawed on leather reins and belt straps, desperate for something to fill their bellies. Mothers scraped mold from bread and soaked it in broth, making it stretch just one more day. Meat was a miracle. Salted pork was gold. And when the snow came early or the buffalo didn't return, the land turned cruel. Families boiled tree bark, shredded old clothes for soup, and licked the inside of pots for warmth more than flavor. Neighbors became strangers when food ran out. Game disappeared from the woods, birds fled the cold, and seeds failed to sprout. Parents skipped meals for their kids, growing weaker each night. Fathers coughed blood and still went hunting. Mothers gave the last crumbs to their infants, smiling with hollow eyes. And when every drawer was empty and every trick had been tried, some did the unthinkable, not out of evil, but because the frontier didn't care if you were good. It only cared if you could survive one more night. 3. Death. Had many faces on the American frontier, death didn't need ceremony. It crept in silently, dressed in dust and bone, and took what it pleased. There were no reapers swinging scythes, no whispered warnings in the dark. Death came as a fever, shaking a child until they stilled. It came in the fangs of a snake hidden in the grass, or in the hoof of a spooked horse. A broken bone could mean slow death by infection. A sliver under the skin could rot into a death sentence. People vanished in snowstorms, lost between towns, their names remembered only in hollow prayers. Children were swept away in swollen rivers. During spring floods, their small bodies never recovered. Fathers were killed by falling trees or crushed under wagons. Mothers bled to death in childbirth. There were no trained doctors, just makeshift remedies and hope. When someone died, there were no funerals, no flowers. You dug with numb hands, praying the soil would give way and not fight back in its frozen state. Some graves were marked with carved wooden boards, others with stones, many with nothing at all. Died of unknown causes, the tombstones would read. But the cause was always the same: the land. The unforgiving, merciless land. And it wasn't a tragedy. It was expected. Death was as common as sunrise. And each morning you rose, knowing the frontier might choose your name next. There are fourth winters that hunted you. There's cold, and then there's the kind of cold that chews through bone. Frontier winters weren't weather, they were predators. The temperature didn't just drop, it collapsed into a bottomless pit of frost. -40 wasn't rare, it was routine. Winds tore through log walls like knives, whistling lullabies of death. Fires were your only lifeline, and even they betrayed you. You could go to bed warm and wake up encased in ice. Your breath hung like mist, your fingers stiff, your children curled against you like puppies under hides and quilts. If the fire sputtered out, there was no second chance. You didn't relight it. You rose in panic, trembling hands fumbling with tinder in the dark. Some families kept coals wrapped in cloth, hidden in pots, praying they wouldn't die before dawn. Parents lay awake listening for the sound of chattering teeth or silence, because silence meant someone was already gone. Frostbite took fingers. Hypothermia took minds. People walked into blizzards thinking it was spring. Some froze in bed. Their last sight, the wood-grain ceiling of a cabin turned into a coffin. You didn't fight winter. You tried to outlast it. And if you made it to spring, you didn't cheer. You just exhaled. Because winter would be back, hungrier than before. But 5. Isolation was a monster. Forget peace and quiet. The silence of the frontier was deafening, a living, breathing thing that pressed in on the soul. For many families, the nearest neighbor wasn't down the road. It was 10 miles of frozen earth and predator-infested woods away. You could live a year and never hear another voice outside your own family. Letters arrived months late, if at all. News was a rumor that came on horseback. Some cabins saw no visitors for entire seasons. Birthdays passed uncelebrated. Holidays were whispered, not shared. The world shrank to 4 walls, a smoky fire, and the echo of your own thoughts. Cabin fever wasn't poetic. It was madness. Men stared at walls until they wept. Women forgot their own reflections. Children built friends from sticks and shadows just to escape the crushing loneliness. And when storms rolled in, the world disappeared altogether. The windows turned white. The wind screamed. You were trapped with your own fears and the creaking of timber around you. Weeks could pass without a sunrise. Time blurred. Some wrote in journals just to prove they still existed. Others stopped talking altogether. Silence could be louder than gunfire. It could crawl inside your mind and rearrange things. And when the thaw finally came, some didn't walk back into the world. They stayed inside, broken, altered, lost in a place where the only thing louder than nature was nothing at all. 6. Childbirth in the wilderness. Out on the frontier, childbirth wasn't a celebration. It was a quiet war against death. There were no clinics, no epidurals, no trained hands waiting with sterile tools. A woman might go into labor with only her mother or young daughter beside her, neither of whom had ever helped deliver a child. She screamed into a cabin that echoed with loneliness, her cries muffled by wind howling through the cracks in the logs. The floor beneath her was hard, sometimes packed dirt, sometimes splintered wood. Her hands clutched old sheets, sweat pouring from her brow as the pain hit like waves. If the baby came breech, there was no surgical option. If the placenta didn't deliver cleanly, no one could stop the bleeding. Women used belts as tourniquets and bit down on leather straps to keep from biting through their own tongues. Some children were stillborn. Some mothers bled out in front of wide-eyed children who didn't yet understand what death looked like, but would learn fast. And the women who survived? They didn't get to rest. There was no recovery bed, no postpartum care. Within hours, they were expected to stand, to cook, to clean, to bury the tiny body if it didn't make it. They wrapped their pain in silence and got back to the grind of survival, hauling water, chopping firewood, stitching clothes, and feeding the children they still had. On the frontier, new life and death shared the same breath, and every birth was a roll of the dice, with no one to call for help when the gamble went bad. 7. Fire was both friend and enemy. Fire was sacred on the frontier, warmth, light, food, protection. But it was also a sleeping beast. One wrong movement, one forgotten ember, and it woke up hungry. Cabins were built of dry wood soaked in years of smoke and sweat. A single spark could leap from the hearth onto a rag or bed of pine needles dragged in on a boot. And within seconds, everything burned. Chimneys choked with soot exploded with flame. Oil lamps shattered during a tremor or a drunken stumble. Nighttime fires were the worst, silent until it was too late. A soft crackle in the walls was the only warning. Families slept lightly, not from peace, but necessity. Their ears trained to detect even the faintest change in the wind. Water barrels stood by the fire, but in January, they froze solid, useless. Parents taught their children to roll in blankets if fire touched them, to run for the door, to never hide. But sometimes there was no time. Entire families perished in their beds, turned to ash by dawn. And if you escaped, you were left barefoot in snow, staring at the smoking remains of everything you owned. There was no rebuilding crew, no insurance, no relief fund, just charred earth and grief. Fire gave life, but it could take it too, and faster than anything else on the frontier. Law was the bullet you carried out on the edge of civilization. Justice didn't wear a badge, it wore a holster. There were sheriffs, sure, but they were men with tin stars, pinned to fear, often too few and too far away. If you lived outside a town, you were your own law. If someone tried to steal your horse or set fire to your barn, you didn't wait for help. You raised your rifle. Feuds started over land, water, even a glance. And once bullets flew, there were no trials, just funerals. A rustler caught with your cattle was lucky to walk away. Most didn't. Outlaws roamed freely, unshaved and unrepentant, often better armed than the law itself. They didn't knock. They kicked in doors. Some came for money, some for revenge, some for the pure joy of chaos. That's why every man, and many women, slept with loaded weapons beneath their pillows. Gunshots in the night weren't rare. They were reality. And when the law did arrive, it was usually to clean up what was left. A body in a shallow grave. A widow sweeping blood off her porch. Sometimes justice meant taking the law into your own hands. Dueling wasn't outlawed, it was expected. You protected your kin with cold eyes and steady aim, because showing mercy could get you killed. On the frontier, survival wasn't about being right, it was about being ready. The line between lawman and outlaw was thin. Sometimes the only difference was who drew first. 9. Disease was always waiting. On the frontier, death didn't just ride in with bandits. It slipped in quietly through the water bucket, the cooking pot, or a child's cough in the night. Disease was the silent killer that didn't need a gun to ruin a family. There were no sterile hospitals, no doctors with degrees, no refrigerated medicine cabinets, just crude herbal brews passed down from memory and desperation. A child would start with a fever, nothing unusual. But then came the sweating, the shaking, the rash, the strange look in their eyes. Parents watched helplessly as their babies withered away, unable to stop the invisible enemy. Cholera could drain the life out of a grown man in 12 hours. Dysentery made water, the very thing meant to sustain life, the cause of death. Typhoid haunted every fly that landed on uncovered food. When outbreaks came, they didn't knock. They smashed through the front door and took whole settlements with them. Sometimes 10 or 15 people died in a single week. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and grief became part of the air. In the worst cases, there was no option but the unthinkable. If the sickness was too far gone, if it threatened to spread, families made horrific choices. They sealed cabins shut, lit fires, watched the smoke rise as the infected and their moans disappeared into ash. It wasn't evil, it was survival. Because on the frontier, mercy could cost an entire town. 10, dirt, sweat, and no escape. Forget everything you know about cleanliness. On the frontier, filth wasn't a sign of neglect. It was a badge of endurance. Bathing was rare, not because people didn't want to, but because water meant survival, not luxury. Every drop had to be hauled from rivers, creeks, or wells, often miles away. You used water to cook, to drink, to clean wounds. Washing your body came last, if ever. Soap was a mixture of ashes and animal fat, harsh, smelly, and scarce. People stank, men, women, children alike. Clothes were worn until they tore apart at the seams, then stitched and worn again. Underwear wasn't changed. It was layered. Lice burrowed into hair and lived there. Fleas bit babies in their cribs. Skin diseases were common. Sores would open from constant labor and go untreated until they festered into wounds. Toothaches were endured until the tooth cracked in half, then ripped out with pliers or a knife. There were no mirrors in most cabins, no perfumes, no combs. Beauty was irrelevant when your entire day revolved around hauling wood, fixing fences, and surviving. Women wiped blood from their hands and kept working. Men dug trenches with cracked fingers, sweating through the stink of their unwashed bodies. There was no deodorant, no break, no reprieve. You didn't aim to be clean. You aimed to stay standing. Because out there, hygiene wasn't about presentation, it was about how long your body could last before it gave out completely. 9/11. Education was a luxury. In the modern world, school is a right. On the frontier, it was a miracle. For many children, there were no classrooms, no chalkboards, no desks, just the dirt under their feet and the chores in their hands. Books were rare, so rare that a single Bible might serve as the only reading material for a family of 10. Paper was more valuable than some food. Pencils were passed down like heirlooms, their stubs sharpened until they disappeared. Most learning came not from lessons, but from labor. A child's first education was the sound of an axe splitting wood, the weight of a water bucket, the technique for setting a snare. By age 7, a child might be breaking horses or hunting rabbits. By 10, they were stitching clothes or loading rifles. If a traveling teacher rode through, families would send their children with slates and trembling hands for a few weeks of numbers and letters, but it never lasted. Work always called them back. Some kids never learned to read, others signed their names with an X. But what they lacked in school books, they gained in grit. These children could skin a deer before they could spell it. They could build a shelter, start a fire, and cook their kill, all before they reached the age of 12. On the frontier, you learned what you needed to stay alive. Everything else was a luxury no one could afford. So the next time someone paints you a picture of the Wild West with clean-shaven cowboys, glittering saloons, and golden sunsets, don't be fooled. That version is for books and bedtime stories. The real frontier was sweat and blood and silence. Picture a mother alone in a dark wooden cabin, gripping a soiled cloth between her teeth, as she brings life into a world that might take it the next day. Picture a child no taller than a fence post, holding a rifle that shakes in his arms but aiming anyway. This wasn't just a place, it was a crucible. And this was wild America.